Yeah, hello, everybody. Our show today is titled Psychedelics, Cutting Edge Science, or Shamanic Ritual. Based on our discussion last week, where we looked at what was happening within the Jewish religious community, um, I happened to give a talk somewhere last week. And after the talk, a middle-aged man came up to me, average person, just an average, typical middle-aged person. And he said to me, "What do I think of ayahuasca?" So I said, "Listen, I've got my own views on it. Um, I don't partake in any of these psychedelics." But he says to me, "No, no, no, at his shul, people told him, all like religious people came up to him and said, no, they must come on a certain event, and they're all going to participate in a ceremony, and it's very, very good, but it's cutting edge science, and it's good for the brain. You get absolute clarity, and you also start experiencing the things that you learn about in Jewish mysticism." So this is what this guy tells me. And when I've seen examples of this time and time again, as we mentioned last week, but when I saw that it's now moved on to it's become so mainstream that you can't give a share without someone talking about it. You can't go to the shops without somebody saying something about this. So I decided that I want to look at the claim that psychedelics are cutting edge science. Because this person spoke about the proven scientific value, it is taken for granted. Everybody takes that for granted. All the professors are doing this, everybody's doing it. It's proven. There's no room for discussion anymore. It's done. And this man told me it's trusted, or he trusts these religious people because he looks to some of them, up to some of them as his teachers. He wants to go along with it. So what I did is I decided to examine some of the academic literature from the late 1950s until today, actually until last year, and try and assess how solid the claim is of a scientific basis for psychedelics, or their value, having a scientific value, having been proven unequivocally that it is good for your mental health. And in the interest of fairness, I've looked at the scholarly arguments from both sides, for and against psychedelics. So if you just tune into a part of the shir, just make sure which part you're tuning in, because you may get a very different impression of where I stand on the matter, on this matter. All right, so let's start with a little bit of history. In 1938, Albert Hofmann, who was working for a Swiss pharmaceutical company, synthesized what later became known as LSD. He wasn't looking to try and discover a drug. He was looking for something that would stimulate circulation. And for a couple of years, the chemicals lay around in his lab, and he eventually ingested a tiny amount by accident of this drug, LSD, and he had the most wonderful and terrifying experience, and it changed him forever. So we see that LSD is a relatively new invention, discovery, 1938. Another popular psychedelic is psilocybin, which is a mushroom. It's a little brown mushroom. And that hasn't been discovered recently. It has been rediscovered recently because it's natural. So obviously it's been there forever. But it was used for hundreds of years by Mexicans and South Americans and indigenous people as part of a sacred spiritual sacrament. And then after the Spanish conquest, in what was probably the first war on drugs, the Roman Catholic Church, this is in 1620, prohibited the use of peyote, which is a cactus, and psilocybin, which is a mushroom, and they absolutely outlawed it. Legally, it was banned, banned substances. And it remained hidden from the Western world ever since then for centuries, until somebody called Gordon Wasson, on a trip to Mexico in 1955, happened to be stopping somewhere on his trip, and he was offered some of this magic mushroom, which was illegal, it was underground. And once again, he had the most wonderful experience. So we now have in the world LSD, psilocybin, and a host of other drugs as well. Now, in the 1950s and the 1960s, the psychedelic community, or this new psychedelic community, welcomed and considered the both LSD and psilocybin to be miracle drugs. This we all know with the hippie culture. But then from the end of the 1960s, the dark side of psychedelics began to set in, began to be exposed. And there was what you can only describe as a cultural panic. What is happening to our youth? What is happening to the not-so-youth? What's happening to our world? And these drugs became illegal again. And the users, as you know, all went underground. And this clampdown continued for about 2 decades until the 1990s, when a small group of psychotherapists, as well as scientists, rekindled their interest in psychedelics. They said, wait, we need to take a second look. Let's look at this again. And till now, there's been this cultural panic. Drugs are bad, they're terrible, they're harmful. And this group got down, they sat down at the beginning of the 1990s and they said, let's reassess. Let's see if we can use these drugs responsibly. So this was now a new rekindling of interest, of scientific interest, of research interest into the effects of psychedelics, hoping to perhaps find a way that could be helpful in help with addiction, etc., etc. And this research continued, and it seems to have peaked in the year 2006. A certain paper came out, which we'll speak about in a while, a groundbreaking paper, a scientific paper published in a peer-reviewed and published in a journal. And then after that, there's been a profound resurgence in the research on psychedelics. And this has been welcomed in some circles, and of course, it's been criticized in other circles. One of the criticisms against this new type of research, and we're going to go into both types of research, so I just ask you to keep an open mind, don't form any conclusions at this stage. In fact, it's always good not to form conclusions and keep your mind open in general. But part of the criticism was that, for example, Michael Pollan wrote a book about this. He personally experimented with a number of psychedelics, and he wrote about his experiences, and he interviewed all the leading scientists who were involved in research on psychedelics. And initially, with this resurgence of scientific research, he wrote that most of the time it was conducted by scientists who were inspired, and I quote, by their own personal experience of the compounds. So they experienced it was wonderful and they wanted to promote it, or they just reflected what their subjective views were on the topic. And that's how the early science was actually constructed. Again, he claims that particularly the early academic studies were not conducted the way one usually conducts scientific experiments and scientific research. They weren't controlled by modern standards. Some of them were compromised by the exuberance and the enthusiasm of the researchers, many of them who had been on these drugs as well. And one case in point, the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz regarded basically anyone to be a researcher. So if you had experimented with psychedelics and you were able to collate a little bit of material, you were regarded as a researcher. So the rigorous scientific methodology was not always adopted, particularly in the early research. The question is, has that changed? I mean, that is the question. Can we still say this, that the research is not thorough research? Can we still say this today? That's our question. That's what we're going to look at now. Or we're going to glimpse into some views on the matter. Now, how do psychedelics work? The best way to understand something is to disrupt it. You know, those what do they call them? Those snowballs, snow machines. I don't know what the kids play with them. You shake them up and everything gets disrupted. You study them and then you see what happens. You see where they fall, you see where they go, and you start looking at patterns. So neuroscientists began to deliberately disrupt the normal waking consciousness of volunteers. So we all operate in a waking consciousness. Now, they wanted to disrupt it. And in doing so, they would dissolve the ego, the sense of selfhood that we all have, because we look at the world through our eyes, through our experiences. It's hot if we feel hot, it's cold if we feel cold. And they wanted to delve into, and here we see a very interesting thing. In what's supposed to be a field of scientific research, they start speaking about, and I quote, mystical experiences. So now scientists are looking at mystical experiences. So once the brain has been disrupted, one begins to experience these mystical experiences. And the disruption is psychedelics. They're conscious and they experience a mystical event. But sometimes this has an opposite effect, because yes, they lose their ego, so they become part of the oneness of the universe. Again, it sounds as if we're giving a talk in some form of mysticism, Neoplatonism, or something like that. But this is part of the actual terminology that's used in these scientific reports, the mystical experience. One loses one sense of selfhood and one merges with the universe, with the oneness of the universe. But the problem is that, yes, you do lose your sense of self, but then when you come back, it can also lead to a boost of the ego. In other words, a kind of arrogance, which is exactly what you're trying to get away from, because the volunteer or the participant now has a privileged sense of being part of a small group, although growing, but a small group of people who have the experience of the oneness of God, who have this mystical experience backed, allegedly, by science. And this massively inflates the ego. So while you may lose the ego during the experience, when you come back, you now have an inflated ego because you've touched the hand of God. And you, in Poland's words, soul possession, you've been granted the sole possession of a special key to the universe. And that's why so many people, these people become teachers. In a psychedelic sense, because they hold knowledge, they become masters. One studies this in life. Yes, a peer review. In peer reviewed, and it's published in a journal, so it's been looked at by many eyes. It's been critically examined by many people. It's published in a German in a journal. Psychopharmacology is the name of the journal, and it has a very strange title for a scientific paper. And the title is psilocybin. Okay, that's the mushroom, the brown mushroom. Can occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. That is the title of a scientific paper. Spiritual significance, mystical type experiences, personal meaning. How do you evaluate these things scientifically? I'm not saying you can't think that you're having experience or even have the experience, but how do you evaluate these things? And this was regarded as the first real thorough modern study of psilocybin. And astoundingly, it did not focus on the science of the drug. This is what's astonishing. One would have expected the journal to focus on how the chemicals work. What is the science of the chemicals? What are the possible therapeutic applications? How can you use this again to treat addictions, etc., anxiety, whatever the case may be? That would be good research. But instead, it focused on the spiritual effects. And the title was speaking about spirituality, mysticism. And Griffiths himself, the author of this paper, admitted and acknowledged. He said he's not looking at the science. He's not looking at the chemicals. He's looking at what we call phenomenology, which is basically the way you view the world, subjective viewing of the world, how you feel about your experiences, which is wonderful. We should all be in touch with our feelings and be able to speak about them. But it's very difficult to speak about this in scientific terms. It's very difficult to speak about this in terms of an actual science. And Griffiths himself acknowledges once again, and I quote, "We were interested in a spiritual effect." Clearly, he's not interested to see, he's not looking at the chemicals. He wants to see not just the effects and how the effect, but the spiritual effects. So now what's happening now is the study of psychedelics is moving into a very strange area for a science. And he writes, initially in that direction. So clearly he's acknowledged he's biased towards spirituality in his paper. And the truth is, and something that Poland points out as well, he says it's very difficult to perform experiments, scientific experiments with psychedelics. Why? For the very simple reason, it doesn't have the same effect every time and doesn't affect all people the same every time. It affects you differently depending on how you enter into the experience. It magnifies whatever you are thinking and doing or whatever is concerning you or occupying your mind or your thoughts or your subconscious at that time. So it's very difficult to extract exacting scientific data. Now, how safe are psychedelics? So, again, personal feelings aside, and let's just look at some of the research. So, according to pollen, it's almost impossible to die from an overdose. We're talking about psilocybin and LSD. And he says they are not addictive. So you can't get addicted to LSD and you can't get addicted to mushrooms, psilocybin. The effects of the drugs are sometimes frightening and extreme, he acknowledges, extremely. We'll touch upon some of these extreme events in a moment. But he says that they're not dangerous. So a person who's relatively healthy, they are not dangerous. They're not dangerous and they're not addictive and you can't die. Okay? But if you have a history of mental illness, you should not experiment with them because they can trigger psychosis. And another danger of the drug is not a primary effect of the drug, but a secondary effect of the drug is because you go on mind. He can on cliffs these beautiful and vast vistas. I know Adam's just come back from a trip. Pardon the pun, Adam. I'm not inferring anything, Adam. I'm just saying I know you went into the mountains recently. That's all I'm saying. All right. But anyway, they can be dangerous because you can fall off cliffs and you can fall off buildings. And the interesting thing is that some of these drugs are not called drugs. They're not even called psychedelics, but they are called medicines. They are medicines. So you take the medicine. It is a medicine. That's what the initiates refer to it as, a medicine. So essentially, if you're going to do this, you need to do it under professional care when you take this medicine. Now, David Nutt, another researcher, N-U-T-T, he's an expert on addiction. Although, I might add, he was fired from the British government's Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. Now, he maintains that alcohol is more dangerous than both cannabis and LSD. And this is quite well attested by people who take these substances. You can't drive when you inebriated under the influence of alcohol, but it is possible to function fairly well under certain doses of psychedelics. We all know people who microdose and are constantly under the influence, and they still manage to drive. Although I might add, just from our personal experience, they don't park that well. But be that as it may, going back to David Nutt, alcohol is far more dangerous than cannabis and LSD. So your normal drinking of wine and beer and brandy and whiskey is more dangerous than cannabis and LSD. And that ecstasy, Nutt claims, is safer than riding a horse. So people who ride horses suffer more damage than people who take LSD. And from Nutt, and again, this is in a published journal, peer-reviewed research paper. He writes, psychedelics are among the safest drugs we know of. It's virtually impossible to die from an overdose, which parallels what Pollen was saying. You can't die from an overdose. They cause no physical harm. Right? You're not going to go to these are anti-drugs. These drugs can help you because they have anti-addictive properties. Okay, that's what David Nutt writes. Now, just to give you an idea about the scientific rigor in this field, not everybody necessarily agrees that these are the safest drugs in the world, because let's have a look at another paper. This is something that was published in Commentary in 2018 by Paul McHugh. And he writes that the psychedelic experience. Now, this is a completely different from the view from the one that we just heard from Pollen and from Nat. He says that the psychedelic experience is just another form of what's called toxic delirium. Toxic delirium. And he says that this is very common. You can experience without taking psychedelics. Someone who is on their deathbed and is suffering from advanced hepatic or renal or pulmonary disease, where the toxics in the body accumulate, those toxins do to the brain and to the mind exactly what LSD does to a person in a relatively healthy state of mind. Doctors encounter this strange and colorful state of mind, he says, with patients who are on their deathbed and are speculating all sorts of things, and he called the toxic delirium. So that's another view. Not necessarily that's this wonderful mystical experience. It may be, but it to research conducted a large population base. 21-fold increased risk in schizophrenia spectrum disorders, known as NSD, following hallucinogen use. So people who took psychedelics had a 21-fold increased risk of experiencing some form of schizophrenia. And what they found, this was conducted in Canada, nearly 1 million people with no history of psychosis. This is very interesting. 1 million people, that's a large sample of the population, with no history of psychosis, none whatsoever. They required emergency hospital treatment after taking the psychedelics, and they exhibited an increased risk of SSD. And according to Dr. Daniel Myron, he writes that the people came in and they presented as having profound paranoia, claiming that they were seeing things that weren't there, and they were experiencing a total departure of reality. So, I've given you a couple of samples. They're extremely safe, safe as houses, safer than riding horses, and yet, watch out for cliffs and watch out for schizophrenia and watch out for a form of delirium. Let's look at some more research in favor of psychedelics. Robin Cathcart Harris. Robin is a man, and David Nutt. Once again, David Nutt, who was telling us how safe the drug is, and their colleagues. They wrote a paper in 2014. And this was a truly fascinating theory. I mean, it is intriguing, an intriguing theory. I am fascinated by this theory. And here it is. They claim that order and selfhood, which are things that we try instill in our children, order and selfhood. Go out there with a good feeling of yourself. Don't be arrogant, but you must be confident and have order. Don't be a slump. Don't make a mess. Have an order. Have a seder to your day. These are ideas that we try inculcate in our children, and we like to see in societies around us. So that's order and selfhood. They come at a cost to the mind. This is what they found in their research. It's wonderful. Yeah, your house is clean, your kids are well mannered, you can find your pencils. But they come at a cost to the mind. They're not good for the mind, according to this paper. And what order and a healthy sense of selfhood, it's a healthy ego does, is it limits and narrows the influence of the mind on consciousness. In other words, it dulls your consciousness. It deadens your consciousness. Order and a sense of selfhood deadens your consciousness. And they claimed that ancient humans, in other words, early man, and again, I don't want to go into the whole story about early man, etc., but they claimed that ancient humans had different brains to our brains today. Their brains were tending predominantly to the supernatural world and to magical thinking. And so when the sun came up, they'd say, okay, it's a wonderful day. We can go out and, walk in the sun and get see clearer and do work, and we're not going to be cold. They saw it as a kind of a mystical, magical experience, a kind of a rebirth. The gods were shining down. It was now a godly light. It was magical. It was supernatural. That's how they viewed the world. So we view it completely different today. We might have aspects of that. Oh, what a beautiful morning, yes, but primarily that's how they operated. Everything in the world was supernatural and magical and almost theurgic, perhaps. You could influence the powers that be by doing certain things. This later became a hallmark even of modern mysticism. And they call this a way of thinking and way of conducting themselves a primary consciousness. This was known as a primary consciousness. So early man had a primary consciousness, and this primary consciousness was essentially mystical, magical, and supernatural. That's how they survived. That's how they got through the day. They didn't have to be on time for work because they didn't have cars. There was no traffic. They were sitting out in the bush, and the sun meant certain things, and the night meant certain things, and they could control their sphere of influence through their theurgy. And that's known as primary consciousness. This was wonderful, for their sense of spirituality, but it wasn't a good model to ensure the advancement of the species. It wasn't good for the long-term success of the human species. People weren't living long; they were dying. If you think you can fly, you start falling off cliffs. It wasn't good for self-preservation of humanity. So they claim that as time moved on, a higher form of thinking emerged where the ego and selfhood and the ability to self-reflect. Now, is it good for me? Is it good that I cut myself? Is it good that I stand on a cliff? It's not good to the guy who did it before. Do you think I should be doing that? Started to self-reflect and to self-reason. Because the ego, I'm a me, I've got to say, I've got to preserve myself, I've got a family. We want to perpetuate the species. And we were thinking about these things. All now revolved around the ego, not around the oneness of the universe and the supernatural world, but about me. How do I stay alive till sunset when I go to sleep? So they began to self-reflect and self-reason. And this is known as a secondary consciousness. The primary consciousness is early man with the magical thinking. The secondary consciousness is a consciousness that revolves around the ego and a sense of selfhood. And this was good for the species because people lived longer. And we obviously living in the era of secondary consciousness. Some might argue we've gone a little bit too far and too concerned with our egos. But the authors of this paper, they contend that, and again, this is fascinating, that psychological disorders, listen to this, psychological disorders come not from a lack of order. One would have thought people have psychological disorders. It's a disorder because they don't have order. But according to this paper, they don't come from a lack of order. They come from too much order. So when you have too much order in your life, when there's too much Seder, according to this paper, then there's too much order. you get a psychological disorder, kind of to take you back to how you should be with the primary brain. Yeah, the disorders are caused by the order. So our modern world has too much order, and that's why people suffer from so much disorder. And they go on to say that because of our focus with our secondary consciousness on the ego, our egos now become overbearing. What happens when our egos are overbearing? Me, me, me. Eventually, oh, me, I don't like me. I'm depressed with me. I'm angry at myself, because depression is anger turned inwards towards myself. So my ego is overbearing. So my ego is a result of my depression. If I didn't have an ego, I couldn't be depressed. I couldn't be depressed if I was part of the oneness. So this is now, and this is the point of their paper, this is where psychedelics can help us today in today's world. Because what psychedelics do is they take this overbearing preoccupation with order and with ego, and they disrupt it intentionally through chemicals. The chemicals disrupt the order. It has completely broken down the order. There's no sense of order whatsoever. There's no stereotypical patterns of thought anymore. You no longer think the same way. You don't no longer look at the problem the same way. You're looking at the problem in a different way, in multiple ways, simultaneously. And the psychedelics completely disintegrate the patterns of neural activity while you are under their influence. In other words, what the psychedelics do, according to their theory, is they offer you a regression into primary man, primary humans. You go back to the cave, in a sense. You go back to early man, and you experience a more primitive, the original sense of cognition that early humans had. And this experience allows you, through experiencing it, to have a potential to reshape your attitudes. Now your attitude, once you've tasted the oneness of the universe and the openness and the mystical experience, you can't go back to your ego the same way as you did before. And what it does is, once you negate your ego is no longer your authority. You're not governed by your ego. What's in it for me? But what happens next? You negate other forms of authority as well, not just your own authority of your ego, but other forms of authority. And this is why we saw in the 1960s a complete revolution against society. No one wanted to go to the army. No one wanted to be part of society, because there was a rebellion against not just the selfhood, the sense of selfhood, but there was also a rebellion against the authority of authority, not just the authority of selfhood. Okay, so this is it's a fascinating theory, and this went on to inform a lot of attitudes that still prevail to this day when it comes to the positive effects of psychedelics. Now, another study that was conducted, this is really, really an interesting one. I'm going to put up on the blog two pictures where you'll be able to see a picture of the brain before psychedelics and a picture of the brain, or a representation of the neural passages under the influence of psychedelics. So this study was conducted by a group of people, including Nutt and Catherine Harris, once again, the same people as before, but a group of other people as well. And they showed that during psilocybin, that mushrooms again, the lines of communication within the brain are radically reorganized. So if you look at the before picture, you've got your brain, okay, so you've got this little circle more or less, and you've got a couple of lines where there's the wires go, here's a one here, one there, a couple there. It's in a nice order. There's a lot of open space in the middle, not much traffic. You want to scratch your ear, okay, you want to drive your car, another one, a couple of things that we basically do to get through a day. Not much not much was going on. But under psilocybin, everything gets connected. Here, there, up, down, inside, outside, everywhere, simultaneously, all the time. Everything's going. It's like haphazard. Just every line that can possibly connect anything is connected. And there's lines, and everything, your whole brain's on fire. Everything goes up. Goes up in, lights up. And regions of the brain that don't usually communicate with each other are now communicating with each other. Everything's communicating. Everything's talking to each other at the same time. And this gives rise to what they call synesthesia, where your sensory information becomes entangled. So you start, instead of hearing sounds get colors. And colors are not just seen as colors, but they're heard as sounds. So you hear what you see, and you see what you hear. If I might add in parenthesis, reminds us about what happened at Har Sinai. But let's leave that for the moment. So the argument of this paper is that such an experience of, getting everything opened up and exposing all, clearing the roads of the snow so you can go wherever you want. This experience creates a fresh perspective, or a potential for a fresh perspective after the events, and allows for stagnancy to give rise to creativity. All right. Let's look now at the research in terms of strengths and weaknesses. So what I did is I found, I'll come to that in a moment. Okay. According to two researchers, Fadiman and Harmon, what they did is they gave LSD to a group of artists and architects and engineers who had all complained that they weren't as creative as they should be, so they were stagnating in a sense. So they were given psychedelics. But Fadiman himself, who conducted the research, admitted that, and I quote, "We used every manipulation of set and setting in the book." There's what's called set and setting. Set is your mindset. When you come into a drug experience, two things are important. You have to come in with a certain frame of mind. Remember, we mentioned that depending on your frame of mind, that's what your experience is going to be. So you have to have a certain mindset. So you come in with a set. That's called a set, the mindset. And then there's the setting. We'll come to this more in a moment. What does the room look like? What sounds are there? That's the setting. The set and the setting are conducive to a proper experience of psychedelics. So you can't just do it randomly. You have to have a certain mindset, and you have to be in a certain space, a certain setting. But he claims that he manipulated every set and setting in the book to try and bring out as much creative energy as he could. This was his intention in the first. This is how he set about. So he was anticipating something to happen. He wasn't just observing, which is the usual way that scientific research works. He was trying to bring it out to the best of his ability, to bring creativity out of this group of stagnant creators. And according to the research, the people who formed part of this group went on to revolutionize computers. One of them invented the mouse, which we use in our computers, the mouse, as a result of this experience, email, and video conferencing, according to this paper. Now, again, it's hard to know whether that one experience with psychedelics was exactly the cause of those creative events that reshaped our societies today, because we use this all the time. Right now, we're using probably about three of those inventions that were brought about through that drug event. It's hard to know whether that wouldn't have come about by itself. But according to this paper, the creative energies were the psychedelic experience was foundational in drawing out these creative energies and these creative effects from these people. However, critics of this paper say that the study was not controlled. I think that's what I was trying to say as well. You know, how do you prove that the mouse was the result of a psychedelic experience? It might have happened afterwards, but how do you prove that? It's very difficult to prove. So there were some of the criticisms. And it also relied on the subject's own impressions, which is subjective. So they all said, no, we felt very creative, maybe, but I mean, I can feel that I'm anything. And also the study ended before it was completed, as strange as that might seem. So was this a real paper? Some might argue, not really a real scientific paper. Someone else called Rick Dublin reenacted some of the early experiences, some of the early experiments by Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary, remember, I think he was arrested something like 69 times or something, or 39 times, I don't know. But he was one of those early gurus of the psychedelic movement. And he did all sorts of experiments at university. And that's where I think this whole notion of cutting-edge science probably first began. You know, all the sciences are doing it. It's a rave. There's no question that this is pure science now. That's probably where that began. But anyway, so Rick Dublin reenacted one of Leary's experiments, and it's a famous experiment that he did at a prison, where he gave the inmates psilocybin, that's the mushroom, and before the experiment, 80% of criminals who were released ended back in jail after their release because they did the same misbehavior. They repeated their misbehavior and they landed up back in jail. So 80% of people landed up back in jail. Now, Timothy Leary claimed that if you had psilocybin, only 45% of the inmates landed up back in jail. So you have a chance of changing people's lives for the better if you take psilocybin. There was that experiment, and Rick Dublin ended up and showed that those numbers were completely wrong. They're just nothing near that claimed rate of success. And another researcher, funny, maybe not Leary, but many of the people were Jewish. He says that this kind of research is what made scientists win. So this is made scientists win. And regarding this project, I assume was also Jewish, that's irrelevant to our discussion anyway. He said that this work violates the values of the academic community. It's quite strong wording. The research into psychedelics often violates the values of the academic community. The whole program has an anti-intellectual atmosphere. People are looking to show certain things, as looking to show mystical experiences, talking about matters of the spirit, based on subjective views of people who have taken the drug. Its emphasis, Kelman continues, is on pure experience. How do I feel? And not on verbalizing findings. It's not on data. You can't really get data. It's not real data. It's not real scientific data. It can make scientists wince. That doesn't mean that all the research is like that, but a lot of it is. Now, in 1999, going back in time a little bit, the UCLA psychiatrist Charles Grob he wrote that psychedelic therapy is the same as shamanism, like a shaman, those magical miracle workers that you find in indigenous communities. And he writes, by blurring the boundaries between religion and science, which is what psychedelics do and which is what the research into psychedelics does, it mixes religion, spirituality, and science. It mixes everything together. The psychedelic model entered the realm of applied mysticism. So now what they do is, yes, they study value, but then you need to call it, you can't call it hard science anymore. You need to call it something like applied mysticism. That's what you're studying. You're studying applied mysticism, not really science. To this day, and yes, of course, there are exceptions. There is good research. I mean, we have looked at some of the research. But what I did is I went to a recent study, just to see when this was, 2024. Okay, that's fresh, relatively fresh research. And I especially want to look, sometimes with academic papers, you get, after a period of time, someone does a survey on the research of the last 20 years. We found this in Judaism as well. The last 10 years of research in Hasidism, for example, is always fascinating to see who's come up with what. So I thought I'd try the same methodology and apply it now instead of to our usual topics. To look at research that was conducted between 1991 and 2023. I guess that's relatively recently. 9 scientific papers that had been published, because this gives an overview. I'll call it good as bad. Let's get a hopefully non-biased overview. And this paper was peer-reviewed, and it's an overview. So it's very difficult. It's very difficult to distort anything in an overview of all these papers. And it involved all in all 20,000 participants who participated in these trials and experiments. And at the end of each study, you usually have 2 columns, strengths and weaknesses. So you say, right, we looked at X amount of people. They were from, and then you look at the strengths. Yeah. Is this a good sample of humanity, or maybe it's only people who live in a certain suburb under war conditions, let's say, then it might not be a good reflection of all of society. In a strengths versus weakness evaluation of the samples, because you always have. So this is what I glean. This is my collection. I'll just read you a few of the things. This overwhelmingly, and that's a weakness. Not representative. Subjects recruited using chain referral method. These all I've just taken these randomly, but they reflect generally the average of the findings. White, they only looked at white people, highly educated in the one study. Researcher knew several participants, mainly male, no control group. Study used some ad hoc and unvalidated measure. Retrospective self-report design only included participants who endorsed belief change. So those who said, no, nothing happened to me, they got chucked out of the program. Only those who claimed, no, my life has been dramatically changed, were included. Insufficient demographic information, small homogeneous samples, No empirical measures used. High rate of non-completion. All right, so that is basically a summary of the overview of the scientific research into hallucinogens in the last 20 odd years. So while there may be solid academic research on psychedelics, I've said that a few times, I'm not saying that there isn't, and I'm not saying that there cannot be benefits. And if you remember, I mentioned Breyer. He was the son of the one Boyana Rebbe and father of the other, and a psychiatrist at Yeshiva University. He said we should support responsible and proper scientific research into psychedelics because it could be of benefit. But of course, he then listed a whole lot of halachic restrictions, where if you just take it recreationally, or if you try and self-medicate yourself, he claims that its use is completely against halakha. But be that as it may, there certainly are proper scientific research papers. And there is a role for psychedelics in medicine under controlled conditions. Okay, and I've said that a few times, and I genuinely believe that. But there's also a significant, and I say this in brackets, and overwhelming. I mean, I may be wrong, but my perception, and I really try to be as neutral as I can in going into the research. But this is not my field of interest. It's my field of interest. It's certainly not my field of expertise. I have no field of expertise. I'm just a student. But it seems as if there certainly is a significant level of substandard research. Let's put it that way. I believe that it's bordering on the overwhelming, but I may be wrong. I'd love to be proved wrong. I'm going to start concluding because, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm interested in the use of psychedelics by religious people in the Jewish community, and by frum people who are using it as a tool, the same way as alcohol was used in the past to get close to Hashem, to get close to the people in the Kehillah, the Farbrengen. It's now used as alcohol on steroids, and it's promoted by frum people to other people in the Jewish community, my own community, our community. I have lots of reports, especially since I last article, I've been contacted by so many people, so many communities who say that they're experiencing exactly the same thing. There is a very solid people, all communities. I mean, some of the stuff I told you last week comes with a hechsher from one rabbi. I happen to know him. He's a conservative rabbi. He's given a hechsher to certain of these materials. Okay, but anyway, what interests me is from a theological point of view. How are we able to suddenly introduce a new? I mean, we don't bring anything new into Judaism. we want to make sure that we stay in the straight and narrow, and yet we're bringing something in here that is so dramatically disruptive. And the proponents are very often from people, and they're encouraging other people. In my case, someone who wasn't all that frum was drawn into this because the frum people are doing it. And that was his hechsher. Okay, so let's look at some of the reported mystical effects of psychedelics. And I think this is important for people who, like before, were interested in Hasidus and Hispoidus and Hispoidinus and whatever they were doing. And they found now, well, we have a wonderful way to do all these things that our mystics have been speaking about throughout the ages. We can do it ourselves. We don't have to do it the old-fashioned way. We can do it now, but we can get to that same state. Most often what is reported in the scientific literature is that people experience, and they use this term, and I mentioned it already, a mystical experience, which is strange in scientific writing again, but a mystical experience. And let's dwell on this for a moment. Now, a possible positive use, or some people may argue it's not positive because it may not be real, but it can still help. And that is with people who are terminally ill. People who research done on people who were terminally ill, who were administered some of these psychedelics, mentioned that after the experience, they completely lost their fear of death. They said, okay, they sort of touched the hand of God. They felt that they had died. They weren't worried about death, and they were prepared to to let go easier. Many reports claimed that people had become more, that found spiritual meaning in their lives. So the claim is that it's actually good for religion because it makes people more religious. I will give you some counter research in a moment. But yes, there is this claim that people find that they have a mystical experience and that they find spirituality. They go to a place where physical laws no longer apply. So they've been in the spiritual realm. They don't just hear about it. They know that the room doesn't stop at the wall. It goes through the wall. Now, according to Bill Richards, he's a psychologist and an international leader in the study of psychedelics. He writes, if you go deep enough or far out enough into consciousness, so if you go deeply into the realm of the mind of consciousness, look what he says, you will bump into the sacred. In other words, you will hit God. And this is why this study includes spirituality and having mystical experience. A mystical experience is a confrontation with God. If you go deep enough, if you go far enough, if you try hard enough, if you go extreme enough, you have to bump into the sacred. You will bump into it. It will hit you like a ton of bricks. And he says that this happens to believers and non-believers as well. So non-believers touch God. Gordon Wasson, he was the guy who rediscovered psilocybin on his trip to Mexico in 1955. He writes that when he took the stuff, he saw all the archetypes. And if you know about mystical thought, you've got the he wasn't necessarily referring to Jewish mysticism, but the spiritual archetypes. You see all the archetypes, and people who take the stuff start talking about archetypes. They saw the archetypes. These are the Platonic, or he called them Platonic. I would call them Neoplatonic ideas. But anyway, you see these Platonic ideas. And what's interesting is, he quotes, this is Wasson again, he says, they were not blurred or uncertain. In other words, you come out with an absolute conviction that you've seen the archetypes of the spiritual realms. You've seen the angel of death, you've seen the angel of kindness, and you've seen the angel of bad and evil. You've seen your Yetzer Hara, you've seen your Yetzer Tov. You've seen the souls of all the great people who've come before you. This is the conviction that people have often after this kind of experience. And you know something, there's even a study of what's called entheogens. So I started studying this entheogens after 1999. What's an entheogen? So it's a substance that you find in the peyote cactus and in the sacred mushroom that's in psilocybin. And these entheogens, sometimes people call it like the God particle. They're actually studying the God particle, which is contained in these substances, in the mushrooms and in the cactus in this case. And they're called, one study, they're called volunteers, and the title of the call for how this is framed. The science is framed in deep religious terminology. Look at Sunday school Bible reading and rediscover your roots. Interested in spiritual life. If you're interested, come participate in this, and you'll become very interested in spiritual life. That's not sold. It's almost evangelical. Now, Houston Smith, writing in 2006, he's saying that you're starting to find in the academic literature, which is very strange. You can call it a fascinating study in applied mysticism. I don't know if you can call it science. But he writes that psilocybin can occasion, and this again, scientific paper, a genuine mystical experience. How on earth do you classify, in scientific terms, a genuine mystical experience? It uses science, Houston Smith writes, which modernity trusts. See, that's the key. Modern people trust science. If you say something is a science, you trust it. People trust science. So if you sell psychedelics as a science, you're going to sell a lot of psychedelics. And this is why I think we understand why everybody is talking about the great science of psychedelics. But anyway, Smith writes that people are using science, which people trust, modern people trust, to undermine modernity's secularism. Listen to what's happening here. We are creating a new religion. So we're using science, because if psychedelics is science, and we're using psychedelics, what are we doing? We're using science. But what are we also doing? We're undermining secularism. I'm not talking about Jewish or any other religion, just about ordinary people in the world. They use science. Psychedelics is scientific, right? So now they have a authorization. It's reliable, it's legitimate, to undermine the secularism in the world, which is now subjectively regarded as something that's wrong. So you're fighting secularism and you're bringing a sense of godliness into the world, but it's not religion. And it offers a sanctification of the natural and social world, because after your experience, you sanctify the natural and the social world. People are good, the world's good, everything's good. So it's not religion. But what have you done? You've created a religion because you're undermining secularism. That's what religion does. Religion undermines secularism. Now there's another energy. It's no longer religion. Psychedelics undermine secularism using science. So they're not using old-fashioned religion, which relies on some crazy tradition that people say, God came down onto a mountain. No, it's proper science. And they're undermining secularism. So they're getting to the same point as religion. So why go through religion? Just go through psychedelics. And it's a defense against soullessness. You become mindful. Look at the words we used to have: mindfulness, soulfulness, all these things. You can get it through psychedelics. You don't need to get it through religion. And it's even better, says Smith. Listen to this. And I actually think he's right. It also can be used to fight religious fanaticism. So now you have a religion that fights secularism, and it also fights religious fundamentalism and religious fanaticism. This is a wonderful religion. So what do we see from this kind of writing? That psychedelics today are framed as being a science-based mystical system. I mean, that's, I think, how you have to define it. It's a science-based, how strong that claim is, well, up to you to decide, but it certainly is science-claimed or science-based, and there certainly is a science in it. But it's a science-based mystical system that challenges modern secularism, and it challenges religion, as particularly religion fundamentalism. So give this to all the religious fundamentalists. People would think of doing this. Give this to all the religious fundamentalists and all the world leaders, and we'll have peace. So what we're doing is, for our purpose, we're now using quasi-religious terminology, and we're turning it into quasi-ritualistic language. See, it's not just psychedelics. We're creating a new religion. And in this new religion, we have ritual, mystical, and setting. So, we spoke about set and setting. Completely unscientific. Your mindset, how do you come into the experience? And the setting, what's the room like? What's the mountainside like where you're sitting? So, what does that mean? You're bringing your expectations in. How do you do a scientific study when you're already priming a subjective response from the subject. The setting usually has a mystical aura. And this is why I say it's related to a new kind of religion. It has a ritualistic order. Where do you have a ritual in science? The environment, the room, the setting. Often during these ceremonies, when psychedelics are administered, you're told to bring a sacred item with you, something special, bring it to the event. And the sacred item is then placed on an altar. They have an altar. Okay, I have a stender here. They can use my stender. But you put sacred items on an altar in science. And they use shamanic practices. They take feathers and they swoosh them. There's incantations. I'm not saying all of the events, but this is often what happens. And to someone observing, it would look like you are simply watching just another religious ceremony. There are extremely subjective indicators here. Extremely subjective. When people write their reports, they write a trip report and keep a log of their trips, and they write that they have a perceived connection with the divine. Again, how do you prove that someone saw God? Once again, they claim that they have significant meaning, spiritual faith, and that they have gone to church and shul and mosque more frequently than they did before. And they're now engaging in spiritual practices because they see the spirituality in their religions. That's just one study. I just want to read you quickly something from another study which completely contradicts this. And this study is really interesting because this was done by a rabbi. There's a rabbi who's a PhD student, Aaron Cherniak at Stockholm University. That's a good place to be. And he writes, now this completely contradicts what we just said. I'm just showing you how interesting the research is. He says that psychedelic users, and I quote, psychedelic users were more likely to leave the religion they grew up in. How's that? Tell this to the religious people in your community who are trying to get you to take psilocybin. According to his studies, which was conducted in 2025, so that's brand new, people who take psychedelics are more likely to leave the religion they grew up in than people who had not used psychedelics. This is so interesting because this guy is completely connected, completely against everyone saying, no, you'll find God. Well, according to this research, there's more chance you'll leave the religion you grew up in. We also studied whether people felt more religious or spiritual over the 2 months after a psychedelic experience. And the results of those studies were negative. No, they did not feel more religious or more spiritual. Now, again, I'm giving you different views of the research. So it just shows we have to be careful where we take our information from. The use of psilocybin, he continues, predicted the greater likelihood of stable non-affiliation. How's that? A stable non-affiliation. In other words, you're not going to be affiliated to anything. It's going to be like a perpetual wanderer. I'll go here this week, I'll go there, I'll just wander around and it's all cool. Stable non-affiliation, that's how he described it. So psilocybin use creates stability. What kind of stability? Stable non-affiliation and de-affiliation. So if you had connections to groups in society or to religion, you'll have a stable disaffiliation to those groups and from the religion you were raised in. So this research is fascinating because it's not so I for people who are in religion. Psilocybin particularly has the effect, according to this 2025 research, of people leaving their religions and becoming disaffiliated with their people and with their religion. And they are less likely to believe in God and in the afterlife than non-users. So this truly rocks the boat of this research, research. You don't find God, you don't find religion, and you don't stay frum, and you become stably non-affiliated and actively disaffiliated. I just thought that was really interesting research. Okay, I'm going to just leave out a bit of stuff, and let me just come right to the end. Okay, I'll take you through what happens in a ceremony. This is what often happens in a ceremony. So if you're interested and you still want to do it after this, well then. Listen to this. This is interesting. So before this is written by Mark Pollan, and he describes a ceremony that he went to because he wanted to write out. And he says as follows: the guides often produce very subjective. You go to a guide. Okay, so first of all, the use of a guide. It's not like you're going to the doctor. You're going to a guide. Guide word. So the guides produce, and listen to what they call. So the subjective language. Flight is, you're going to go on a trip. Boy, are you going to fly? So now we're going to say, the air hostess reads, what to do and what not to do. You're going on a flight. So you've been primed the same way as you've been primed to go on a flight from here across the ocean. Right? You're going to another place. And they're told, so they have what's called TLO. Trust, let go, and be open. Don't fight anything. Just trust, let go. On this plane, loosen it. Don't remain for it. Okay? If you see a door, they say, this is from the flight instructions. If you see a door, they say, open it. Open the door. If you see a door, go open it. If you see stairs, climb it. If you see danger, don't retreat. Run directly towards the danger. Run into the danger. This is prime. Very often, this decor is tribal. There are special aromas. So sight, smell. You wear eye shades sometimes. Mask over your eyes. And you listen to selected music, often with headphones if there are other people in the group as well. And they often sound like church music sometimes. Even heard in Jewish experiences, they play nigunim. And you are told, Poland writes, that if you're told you're just about to, and you're usually nervous before such an event, you've never done it before, imagine you're about to do something that's going to blow your mind, that never happened. It's more scary than going on an aeroplane for the first time. And now you're told that you're going to have a spiritual experience. Colin Russell, chances are you probably will have a spiritual experience. And Colin writes that these props, because he calls them props. And by the way, he's not against it. He came out quite favorably when it comes to controlled research into psychedelics. So he's not anti it, but he does say that the props cast a spell that allowed me to suspend my disbelief. You go to a movie, you need cognitive dissonance. You walk into a theater, it's dark, there's a curtain, there's music. Yeah, so you need to suspend. He says that's what the props do. They allow you to suspend your sense of reality. And he found that the guide was acting more, and I quote, like a shaman than a psychologist. So the guides are sometimes psychologists, but they act not as psychologists, they act as shamans. The facilitator recited a long Native American prayer, and spoke, brought out this huge psilocybin mushroom, this brown mushroom, and he looked, he says, how am I going to eat that whole big thing? But the guide referred to it, the mushroom is your teacher. So listen to this. The mushroom becomes the Rebbe. The mushroom is your teacher who brings back, this is what the guide said, and I'm quoting, who brings back to our souls, who brings back to us our soul's purpose for being here in this lifetime. So the guide is going to tell, and the mushroom is your teacher. The mushroom is your teacher. You're personifying the mushroom. You look to the mushroom as your great teacher. It's not just medicine, which is referred to as medicine, but it's your teacher who's going to teach you why you're here, basically, and what you have to do. What's your purpose? What's your purpose in life? Your mushroom is your teacher. Then he also went on to have another experiment with a toad. That's a frog, a poisonous toad. You find it in the Sonoran Desert around about Arizona. You hunt them at nighttime with headlamps. And this is one of the fastest acting psychotropic drugs. It's a poisonous toad. It has a gland, and you take the gland of the frog, they're quite easy to catch, and you squeeze the gland, hold the mirror up in front, and the venom of the toad, the poisonous venom, goes out the gland and gets squeezed onto a mirror. The mirror is allowed to dry overnight, and it turns into flaky crystals that look like brown sugar. You then put that in a glass, you light a fire underneath and smoke it like a pipe, it's vaporized, and immediately it hits you straight away. The whole event lasts half an hour. The other stuff can last up to 12 hours, where you get sick and you vomit and you think you're going to die. Here, it's only half an hour. And afterwards, he asked the guide, he said, wow, I've never experienced, this was something. This makes all the other things look like child's play. And this was his question. Well, was this an effect of the drugs on my mind, or was it a genuine spiritual experience? Because he saw amazing things. Is this really spiritual, he was asking? I think it's a silly question. Or is it the drugs? But anyway, he asked the question. But the guide gave the answer. That's an irrelevant question. It doesn't matter. It could be a figment of your imagination, or it could be real. It doesn't. That question's not important. I think that question is very important, but many people differ. People today are microdosing. People are encouraging other people to microdose on LSD. In Silicon Valley, when Pollan wrote his book, this was 2018. It was all the rage in the tech communities of Silicon Valley. Once again, everybody was doing it, microdosing. And they did it because these were creative people that wanted to be more creative. Some tech companies, in their management training, gave you psychedelics. And some tech companies, today we have soccer Fridays where you wear a soccer shirt or a rugby shirt or a cricket shirt or whatever it is. There they have microdosing Fridays. So on Fridays, everyone in the tech community is expected to microdose. And the companies encourage this, many of them, in order to create creativity. And people become evangelical about it. They tell their friends, you've got to do it. I mean, this is what we see. I see this unfolding in front of my very eyes. This man I told you about, he had heard in shul from his from other people, and they bring other people who never heard of it. This is evangelical. It's not a religious movement, it's an evangelical movement. Timothy Leary, back in the 60s, in 1968, after a journey with mushrooms, he wrote that, quote, I just want to rush back and tell everyone, see that? He wanted to rush back and tell everyone, you got to do this. He was evangelical. What is it other than evangelical? And he wrote, listen, I quote, listen, wake up. You are God. He sounds like a preacher. Listen, wake up. You are God. You have the divine plan engraved in cellular script within you. Listen. Again, listen to my preaching. He said, take this sacrament. You'll see. You'll get revelation. It will change your life. I don't think I've ever heard a TV evangelist speak with such fire. So we must be aware of a sense of evangelicism within this community. So to summarize, I told you I wanted to go into this because I was shocked to see how ordinary people, middle-aged ordinary man who doesn't smoke, doesn't drink, is now drawn into this. The last person I would have expected. Being encouraged by religious people in his field. Under the guise of genuine science. In other words, every psychologist will tell you this is good for you, and every scientist is finding, and all the tech companies are doing it, and everybody's doing it, and this is the way of the future. So now he wants to be part of that. He doesn't want to be left out. He's a middle-aged guy. He wants to be part of what's happening. He doesn't want to sit in his garden for the rest of the life. So, it's striking to see how readily this uncritical acceptance of claims like this. People believe this. They believe in the evangelicism of the psychedelic world. They hear it. They believe it. And it's an uncritical acceptance. You can accept it. You can accept whatever you want, but let it go through your mind and make a concerted make a concerted effort to look at both sides and make a good choice based on knowledge. And with the claim that it will affect your consciousness and be good for your theology. In other words, it's good for your mind and good for your soul. It's good for your religion, because he was told this by religious people. You'll become more religious. We saw some of the researchers, you'll probably become less religious. But it's good for your consciousness. Who doesn't want in that world, who especially in the religious world, who doesn't want to become more religious? I'd love to become more religious and more conscious. Everyone's consciousness and mindfulness, consciousness, everyone wants to be consciousness. Wonderful. And this evangelicism has now permeated elements. I would say it's reached the stage, it's not just elements anymore. I think it's permeating the Jewish religious world. I hear stories about communities who are, you would never expect them to be involved in this, but they are. People I knew as being conservative people, scholarly people. I'm shocked. So the emphasis, I think, of many of our religious leaders, and particularly in the Hasidic community, if you listen to their talks, and it's even gone, and I'm not about this psychedelic community, I'm just saying in general, and even the non-Hasidic communities have also become Hasidified to some extent, are talking about things. If you listen to their talks, listen to average things that go around on in social media. They talk about mysticism. They talk about ritual. They talk about spiritual. They talk about transcendental experiences. You know, how was your Shabbos? Have a meaningful fast. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Have a wonderful 3-day Yontif. If everything becomes hyper, omni-significant, to have a one-on-one experience with God during your davening. I mean, it's wonderful stuff, but it's not easy stuff if you do it without the psychedelics. But they've been primed to expect it. And again, as I said last week, when you wake up the next morning and you're not so happy you've got to go back to shul for your third day yontif, and the world's exactly the same. Everyone said, "How was yontif?" Wonderful, but deep down inside, you're so glad that it's over. You then start thinking that there's something wrong with you, and then if someone now offers you a shortcut to this mysticism, to this ritual that you've actually heard your rabbis preaching about. They use the same words. Mindfulness, expand your consciousness. Oh, and it's based on science. Don't forget that. It's not, it not only does it have a hechsher, it's cutting edge science. That's how it's marketed. And it goes beyond what we used to do with alcohol, which had a similar effect. People come into religion through the bottle and stay religious through the bottle. This is better than that. It's a better spiritual tool. I think we are witnessing the birth of a new mystical movement. I think, in a way, we are witnessing a nouveau Hasidic movement. We're going back in 1760, just after the Baal Shem Tov passed away, and the new Hasidic movement is birthed. And it takes the world by storm. First there's opposition, it takes the world by storm. I think we are witnessing stirrings of some kind of a new Jewish mystical movement, a Jewish mystical movement, with an emphasis on experiential spirituality, which is in effect what the Hasidic movement brought to Judaism. It brought experientialism, not just dry stuff in a book. You experience it. Your soul is uplifted. It's experientialism. And this emphasis on experiencing it comes out again and again and again. The key of the Hasidic movement, according to early texts, was dveikus, clinging to God. That's what the movement is about, finding new ways to cling to God. They did it in different ways. Some people to enhance their dveikut. It became a bit more philosophical of the time, but originally it was about finding dveikut. A lot of those works were censored out of the Hasidic movement. But we are now experiencing a new way to find dveikut, touching the hands of God. It's a shortcut to dveikut. And in popular religious circles, they've even coined a new phrase. I kid you not. It is now called Psychedelics. And it's not tongue-in-cheek. People are promoting it as a form of Hasidism. They call it Psychedelics. So they claim that they're not doing it recreationally or just to get high and have fun. They're doing it furthering their spiritual projects and spiritual programs. It is Psychedelics. It is a higher form of Hasidut. And hence I think these are stirrings of a new movement. How big it will be, I don't know. And I'll tell you something else. And with this, I will absolutely conclude. It's not only a new Hasidic movement. I would claim it's a new Kiruv movement, a outreach movement. Because people who have never done it before are being enticed to do it. I told you, I spoke to a group of school children. I said, how many of you are doing this? I was told 100% of the class. These are people with Torah education and yeshiva education. I spoke to them years later after school. They'd already been to yeshiva. They sometimes found it in yeshiva. They were introduced to it there. So there is a kind of a kiruv movement as well. So we've got the ingredients. We've got experientialism. We've got the Dveikut. We've got the Psychedelics. And we have a form of Kiruv. This man I was telling you about was Makarov into this particular movement. And leadership turns a blind eye to this. You know what they said about Albert Hoffman, who we spoke about right at the very beginning? He was the person who discovered LSD in 1938. He discovered it by accident, remember? We spoke about him. He worked for the Swiss pharmaceutical company. And he wrote, actually, Michael Pollan wrote about him. He then became like a religious leader. He became the Rebbe of psychedelics because, and I quote from Pollan, he says, he became something of a mystic. People almost pilgrimaged to him. When he came into a hall, people stood up. It was dead silence. He became a guru. He became a mystic. He was a scientist, but he became a mystic. And, quote, he was preaching a gospel of spiritual renewal. He was really working in 1938. Already, okay, Pollan is writing later, but even in the early days, they were talking about a gospel of a spiritual revival. These are the words that are used to describe the drug. And I would say it's not a big jump to use similar language to describe what's going on. A gospel of spiritual renewal. And Pollan continues, referring now to Albert Hoffman as the founder of a new religion. And I think we are too witnessing now a new Jewish evangelicism, kind of a Kiruv, as I said. And we've replaced the old methodology, which is hands-on, working and grappling with faith and doubt the hard way, because we now have a shortcut. So what I wanted to do today is I just wanted to challenge two of the most often touted justifications for taking psychedelics. You may come across this. I just wanted to point out two challenges. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm not saying you must listen, but I'm saying there are two possible challenges. Number one, they tell you that there's impeccable scientific research, cutting-edge research, cutting-edge science. Okay? Well, yes, and also no, as we've seen. They also tell you that it is unquestionably compatible with halachic practices because some of these substances even come with a hechsher. Well, we have seen, yes, some of them may come with a hechsher, or do come with a hechsher, but not everybody will be prepared to say that these are drugs that Judaism would encourage, or that the Jewish system, even the Jewish mystical system, would encourage. And as we saw with Breyer, it could be, from a halachic point of view, if you want to be pedantic, one could be, and I don't want to sound preachy, one could be infringing on a host of Isurim that we spoke about last week, including Lifnei Iver, which ties in with my theory of evangelicism. I thank you so much for listening, and hopefully we'll get back to our usual formatting where we discuss issues of history and other things. But this was a little diversion. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.